All right, in this next section, we're going to talk about parent and child rights. Just so you understand, we're not a legal organization. We cannot give you guys legal advice. Instead, think of this session as more of kind of an overview of historical kind of court cases and where we've gone from and where we're heading today. To start off with, I'd like to read to you guys a short quote from the U.S. Constitution, a reader, which was edited by the Hillsdale College politics faculty. And they explain this. They say that natural rights exist prior to any government. Thus, government is not the source of rights, but rather governments are created to secure natural rights. So for us today, the question then is, well, what natural rights are we going to be talking about? And we are specifically being concerned with how we can educate our children. So if that natural right to educate our children is not coming from the government, where is it coming from? Well, certainly in our nation, it is coming from the Judeo-Christian scriptures. So I'm going to read a few verses to you quickly as we dive into this issue. The first one is Deuteronomy 6:4-7. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. These words which I am commanding to you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. Now, at first glance, it kind of looks like it's almost talking to the nation of Israel, maybe the leaders. But when you look at the practical application of this, it's really talking to the individuals within the nation of Israel, that these are things that you should be doing on a daily basis with your children and how to train them up. Now, in Proverbs 1:8-9, it says, Hear, my son, your father's instruction. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are a graceful wreath to your head and an ornament about your neck. And I think this is so cool because this is an encouragement to children that they listen to the instruction of their parents. So that's neat that it's geared towards them. And then finally, Ephesians 6:1-4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. Now, before we move into looking at these court cases, I don't know about you guys, but when I read this, I don't necessarily think so much about these being a natural right. Instead, I look at this as this is the responsibility that God gave to parents. He's entrusting these children, these beings that he created and that he loves, and he's instructing those parents to be responsible for their education. Now, some people might want to argue, well, this is just religious instruction. It doesn't really have to do with that academic, math and science that kids are learning at school. And I'm not going to go into this, but if you are interested in understanding this a little bit more, from antiquity, we had this concept that knowledge and truth was about the whole being. It wasn't just about the things that we can study and see and observe. It was about all those things that we can't see and observe too. And yet, empiricism came in, and now the idea is, in order for something to be truth, you have to test it in a test tube. We have to be able to do an experiment and verify that it's right. And so that's what you're seeing oftentimes is modernity was based on that. This idea that truth is only what is testable. And postmodernism rejects that, which is why we have what we have today, where people are saying, you know what, my internal beliefs and perspectives, they are just as valuable as what I'm learning from a test tube. Okay, so we're kind of seeing this conflict. But the point here is that I don't believe that these verses are just talking about religious instruction. It's talking about the way that you bring up your children in truth in the Lord. Now, I want to jump into a bunch of court cases here. The first court case that I want to share with you is from 1923, Meyer versus Nebraska. This court case essentially said that it is the natural duty of the parent to give his children education suitable to their station in life. This is great because this totally reflects that biblical perspective that it is the responsibility of the parents to educate their children. If you look at the next court case 2 years later in 1925, Pierce versus the Society of Sisters says that states cannot force children to attend public schools only. The child is not the mere creature of the state, Those who nurture him and direct his destiny have the right, coupled with the high duty, to recognize and prepare him for additional obligations. So now we have this concept of rights coming in here. Still kind of going alongside with the responsibility issue, but it's more focused on rights. And if you notice, there's already a conflict in 1925 that the expectation was that children should be going to public schools. And the government had to say, hey, wait a second, we can't force every kid to go to the public school. Okay, so already we're seeing this tension. In 1972, there's Wisconsin versus Yoder. And this stated that parents have a right to direct the education of their children through homeschooling or even vocational work. So again, the focus and emphasis nowadays is on the parent having the right. They can choose the type of education that they believe is suitable for their children. In 1997, in Washington versus Glucksberg, this is essentially reaffirmed. It says that the Constitution, and specifically the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, protects the fundamental right of parents to direct the care, upbringing, and education of their children. Okay, so far we are still on a good track. Until 2000. Okay, Troxel versus Granville does two things. The first thing that it did was it stated that between parents and judges, it's the parents that should be the ones to choose whether to expose their children to certain people or ideas. Okay, so that's a good thing. State isn't the one that should be saying kids need to be learning this, this, and this. You as the parent, you have that right. But it also says that the Constitution permits a state to interfere with the right of parents to rear their children only to prevent harm or potential harm to a child. Now, in many cases, this was a good thing. Parents who are abusing their children or who are negligent, the government can step in and help protect that child. So this was a good thing. The problem is in today's society, not only is safe being redefined, but harm is being redefined. So now if a parent does not affirm a child's new gender identity, that parent is now considered to be causing the child harm, which is why we saw cases like Yaley and her parents where the parents ended up losing custody. Now, I understand that these issues are not easy to talk about. I understand that there are many people out there who think, well, we homeschool our kids, this isn't really, important for us, or maybe I don't have, school-aged children. If this continues to happen in our society where people are redefining what it means to cause harm, it's not just going to be those parents who have their kids in public school that are going to be affected by this. Those parents who are teaching their children through homeschooling about a Christian perspective are now going to be labeled harm because you're teaching this hate speech and bigotry to your kids. The same thing with private schools. Same thing with the church. This affects all of us, okay? This is redefining and reshaping our society. So if Christians keep silent, we can expect society to continue to redefine harm and reinterpret our laws until we no longer are a nation living by Christian principles, and we are rapidly seeing that happening. Okay, the last court case that I want to share with you is from 2005. This is Fields versus Palmdale School District. So the residing judge, Judge Reinhart, basically made this statement. He said the Meyer-Pierce rights, which we looked at in those first two court cases, the rights protected by those court cases do not extend beyond the threshold of the school door. Okay? So what this court case essentially said was that parents have no constitutional right to prevent a public school from providing its students with whatever information it wishes to provide, sexual or otherwise, when and as the school determines that it is appropriate to do so. Okay? That's heavy information. I want to reiterate this for you. A Back to School for Parents guide put out by Family Policy Alliance and Focus on the Family state it this way. You do have the absolute fundamental right to direct the education of your child, but sending your child to public school is considered a choice. If a school isn't violating the fundamental rights of your child, schools have broad discretion in what they can do because parents always have the option to leave. Okay? Now, I understand that there are probably many parents out there, especially single parents who are working, or, married couples and they're both working jobs and they don't feel like it's an option. I understand that it's part of the way our society is right now, okay? It does take a sacrifice to homeschool kids these days. It's not easy. That was a difficult decision for my husband and I when we decided to do it. We agreed that we were going to live off of his salary and not mine. And there are certain things that we had to just cut as part of our life because of that. But it's important, okay? And here's why. It's not just my right to educate my kids. I'm responsible by God for educating my kids, okay? So let me explain this to you really quickly. So what this is saying is that parents have the choice. You can choose how your kids are educated, but if you send them to public school, you're giving your authority to that school to educate your child. Your right then as a parent is just to monitor the school to make sure that they are not violating your child's rights, okay? And we're going to go into that in just a minute here. What are your child's rights then that you need to keep an eye on, and then how are you allowed to monitor that? Okay, so let's look at the child rights. Well, first of all, in the First Amendment, we have a list of some human rights. So the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Okay, that's a lot there. So I'm going to summarize this in 3 quick points about your children. First of all, they have the right to religious freedom. Okay, they cannot be forced to act against their beliefs while they are in the school district. The second thing is that your children have the right to free speech. This means that they are allowed to share their religious views with people. Now, this does not necessarily mean that your children should be using that to instigate people or to demean people, but they do have their right to share their perspective, especially if they see other perspectives being talked about and taught. They have the right to talk about theirs as well. And finally, this does mean that your children have the right to remain silent, okay? They cannot be forced to say anything against their conscience. So if your child does have a Christian viewpoint, your child does not have to use gender pronouns or a person's new name because that conflicts with their religious beliefs, okay? Title IX also protects child rights in that it's a federal law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in schools. So what this means is that your children have the right to equal opportunities in things like sports that was mentioned, okay? You can't have all these sports groups for boys or even after-school clubs and not offer anything to girls, okay? So this protects your children's rights in that. Same thing with facilities. They don't have to have the exact same facilities. They can have separate facilities, but they need to be equal. You can't be offering, all these locker rooms and things like this for boys and not be offering it for girls. This originally was meant to protect women. Now, every presidency, sometimes they try to reinterpret these things, and President Biden was trying to reinterpret this to include a person's gender identity. As far as I understand, that has been rescinded, but that is just something to keep an eye on, that sometimes these things get reinterpreted. Now, that being said, Title IX is a really good thing in that it allows people to have separate but equal facilities. In New York, we have what's called the Gender Bill. Okay, so this is the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act. You may have heard this being called the bathroom bill. This essentially makes gender identity or expression a protected category under New York's human rights laws. So under Title IX, if you had a person who identified a particular way, the law basically said, we need to give you an equal, but it can be a separate facility from other people. New York's law doesn't say that. New York's law says that if you identify as a woman, even though you're a biological male, we can't discriminate against that. We have to let you use whatever facilities you are interested in using. Okay? Now, There's one more thing that I want to mention to you. In every state, a minor has the right to seek permission from a court instead of their parents. There are many activists and organizations out there that will help your child walk through this process. If your child is confused about their gender and wants to get puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones, and you are not willing to affirm that or to pay for those things, there is a right of children to petition the court. What that means then is that the parents are losing custody and they are becoming a ward of the state. So it is the state then that makes the decision about giving those things, the child permission to access those things. Okay? So these are some of your children's rights. Now the question is then, okay, as a parent, if my job, if I'm sending my kids to public school, is just to monitor their rights, how do I do that? The first thing is called the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment. This is a federal law, and it essentially allows parents to monitor the schools by opting their children out of lessons or surveys that may conflict with their religious views. They can review curriculums and lesson plans. They can observe classrooms. They can request specific notification for if their child's personal information is going to be sold. Maybe their child's expected to get a physical exam sometime, or there's a requirement to take a sex education class. The parent can request notification then of those things. Recently, we had the Parents' Bill of Rights Act. This was passed in the House of Representatives, and in order for a bill to become a law, it has to pass the House, the Senate, and the President. Okay, so this is one of the ways that if you are interested in these issues, you can appeal to your senators now and say, please sign on to this bill. But this bill essentially will amend that Protection of Pupils' Rights Amendment that we just talked about, allowing parents to inspect all instructional materials, including the books and reading materials made available to the students through the classrooms and the library. So it's basically just taking what we looked at and expanding it a little bit more. Next, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, or sometimes called FERPA, is very similar. It's at the federal level. It's a law that gives parents the right to inspect the records of their child and the instructional materials. And it essentially just is saying that the local school district is the one then responsible for deciding how is that going to happen? How do parents have to request the information, and how is the information given to the parents? Okay, so these are a number of ways that help parents to monitor their kids' rights in school. Now, the question then is, well, what happens if your child's rights are violated? So we just recommend that the first thing to do is to just write a letter, contact the school, make sure it's in writing so that you have a record of it and you have a record of what the school responds to you, and put them on notice. Explain what right you believe has been violated and how the school has violated that. Maybe offer a solution or ask them how they think it could be resolved, okay? If the school is not listening to you or is not willing to work with you or respond, the next thing that we recommend is that you get a lawyer to write a formal letter for you. This does not mean that you're going to court, but sometimes a letter from an attorney puts the school on notice, and they're much more willing to start working with you. If that still does not work, though, it may end up in court. And if you think about it, from our perspective as our system of government, that's what the courts are meant for. The courts interpret which laws are protecting what human rights and which ones they're not. So that's why people go to court, is to have that determined. Okay, so that's why that might end up happening. And then finally, we encourage you, even before all of these things, to assess your ability to alternative education options. Public education was a beautiful idea, and it started to help support those families, especially in our agricultural society, to be able to educate their children, to give them more options. And that is a good, beautiful thing. But we are in a society today where the public schools are in such need of help, okay? And we are essentially just handing our kids over to that system. And so we just encourage you to be aware of what all of your options are. Are there private schools in your area, micro schools? Can you homeschool? What would that look like for you guys? Along with all of this is just while you guys are going through this process, educate your children about these things. Instruct them about their natural rights, your God-given responsibility from God to protect them, to educate them. Talk to them about the role of the government. Talk to them about what's happening in the school. Do a little investigation. How does the school handle these things? What happens when this happens? Have you ever seen this happen before? Talk to them about these issues. Okay, so to just summarize this section, parents have a God-given responsibility to educate their children. However, if you choose to send your child to school, whether that's public or private, you're essentially giving that school the authoritative power to educate your children. As long as the school is not violating the child's rights, they can teach whatever they believe is best. And if we as Christians keep silent, we can expect our society to continue to redefine harm and reinterpret our laws until we no longer are a nation of Christian principles.